From the very moment we begin to exist, our minds and hearts are in constant motion, moving through currents of thought, waves of emotion, and tides of sensation, most of which we scarcely notice because we are too busy moving forward, trying to achieve, to fix, to be accepted, and to escape what feels uncomfortable within ourselves. Life teaches us to respond, to react, to judge, and often, without realizing it, we grow used to living as if we are at war with our own inner world, labeling some feelings as acceptable and others as weaknesses, running from sadness, fearing anger, denying fear, and chasing joy as though it is a prize waiting somewhere in the future, forgetting that our inner landscape itself is rich, alive, and full of messages that can guide us toward a deep and lasting peace, if only we would slow down enough to listen. Emotional intelligence is the skill of noticing, understanding, and welcoming these messages rather than denying them. And yet most people confuse emotional intelligence with emotional control or perfection, believing that to be wise or capable is to suppress emotion or to never feel strongly. But true emotional intelligence, as taught by thinkers like Christophe André, is not about suppressing or controlling. It is about meeting each experience fully, feeling it in our body, acknowledging it in our mind, and observing it with consciousness without identifying with it, realizing that emotions are not our identity, but messengers carrying important information about what we need, what we value, what we fear, and what nourishes us. The moment we separate ourselves from our emotions, the moment we can say, "I am feeling anxiety," rather than "I am anxiety," we open the door to freedom, a freedom in which feelings can arise, pass, and teach us rather than control us. And in this freedom, we begin to discover that pain and suffering are not enemies to be defeated,
but signals to be noticed, understood, and allowed to move through our inner system without multiplying, because so much suffering is humanly unnecessary, not because life is easy, but because the mind, untrained and unobservant, adds commentary and fear on top of natural emotion, replaying the past endlessly, imagining catastrophic futures, telling us we should not feel what we feel, that we are failing or weak for experiencing it. And thus we create a second, heavier wound on top of the first, a wound that can dominate consciousness until we cultivate the skill of mindful observation, learning to notice the emotion, notice the thoughts about the emotion, and notice the bodily sensations, to separate the signal from the commentary, to treat ourselves with curiosity and compassion rather than criticism, and to breathe with the feeling rather than fight it, because the body itself remembers, carries, and signals emotions long before the mind names them. And when we bring our attention to sensations, whether it is a tight chest, a sinking stomach, a heavy heart, a trembling hand, or a rush of warmth or tension, and simply observe them, name them, and breathe through them, we cultivate a form of self-knowledge and inner steadiness that gradually forms the foundation of peace. To live in awareness of our own inner world is to practice returning again and again to the present moment, not to judge ourselves for wandering, not to demand perfection, but to gently notice that the mind has drifted and bring it back with patience, knowing that the simple act of presence in itself is a practice of liberation. Emotional intelligence teaches that each feeling has its message. Fear alerts us to danger. Sadness signals loss. Anger communicates a boundary. Joy highlights nourishment. And by allowing ourselves to experience these emotions fully, naming them, feeling them in our body, and acknowledging them in our consciousness, we allow our inner world to become a place of dialogue.
In a world where exposure has become almost automatic, choosing not to show oneself raises questions. Today, many people are present on social networks, yet choose to publish nothing, or almost nothing. They observe, they read, sometimes they watch, but they do not turn their life into a display window. This behavior often gives rise to quick interpretations: shyness, withdrawal, lack of confidence, or even disinterest in others. Yet, when we take the time to listen to these people, we discover a reality that is far more nuanced. This digital silence is not emptiness. It is often a protected inner space. Some people have learned, sometimes very early, that showing oneself can expose them to criticism, rejection, and comparison. Others, on the contrary, have developed a particular sensitivity to their inner world and feel the need to preserve their experiences without turning them into images or public narratives. This is not an escape. It is a different way of inhabiting the world. The human brain has always been deeply social. Belonging to a group has conditioned survival. Being seen, recognized, accepted has long been a vital matter. Today, social networks exploit this ancient mechanism. Every interaction, every reaction, every sign of approval activates the reward circuits. This system is not bad in itself, but it becomes problematic when it takes control of self-esteem. When a person publishes and receives reactions, the brain releases dopamine. This substance produces a pleasant but short-lived sensation. The problem is that the brain does not distinguish between real recognition and digital validation. It reacts as if every sign of approval confirmed personal worth. Over time, this creates a subtle dependence, a constant, sometimes anxious expectation of external recognition.
Since the beginning of our lives, and that we now have the capacity to witness it, to meet it, to learn from it, and to use it as a guide toward a life in which we're not at war with ourselves, but in dialogue with the richness of our inner experience, building, moment by moment, the peace that is our birthright, the calm that does not depend on external circumstances, the serenity that arises from understanding, accepting, and befriending the self in all its complexity, fragility, and beauty. And in this way, even amidst life's storms, we can begin to experience a deep and abiding sense of inner steadiness, clarity, and freedom, which is the first true step on the long, human journey toward emotional intelligence, mastery of the inner world, and the enduring peace that is available to every one of us if we choose to pause, to observe, and to listen to the wisdom within.
Suffering is one of the most intimate and universal aspects of being human, yet paradoxically, most of us approach it with resistance, avoidance, and fear, as if pain were an intruder that must be fought or banished. And in doing so, we often magnify our own distress, layering judgment, self-criticism, and anxious speculation on top of the original experience, creating what Christophe André calls the second wound, the unnecessary suffering that arises not from life itself, but from our attempts to escape it. And yet if we learn to turn towards suffering rather than away from it, if we learn to meet it with curiosity and attention instead of denial or repression, we discover that it is not a prison, but a teacher, not a curse, but a guide, showing us where our boundaries lie, what we value, what has been lost, and what we need. And emotional intelligence is the skill that allows us to engage with this inner teacher in a way that is both courageous and compassionate, recognizing that pain, whether physical, emotional, or mental, is not a threat to our wholeness, but a signal to our awareness, and that by observing it, naming it, and allowing it to move through the body and mind, we reduce the additional suffering that fear, resistance, and judgment create. Because much of human anguish comes not from what is happening, but from the story we add on top of what is happening. The narrative of, this should not be, or I cannot endure this, or I am failing because of this feeling. And when we notice these thoughts without merging with them, when we see them as just thoughts, not reality, we begin to create a space of freedom within which the raw emotion can exist safely, flow naturally, and eventually subside. And in this process, we cultivate the subtle but profound art of witnessing ourselves with kindness, acknowledging that it is human to suffer, to feel vulnerable, to feel lost, to feel hurt, and that these experiences do not define us.
Nor do they make us weak, but rather they're the raw material from which resilience, wisdom, and deeper inner peace emerge. Because when suffering is met with awareness, when the mind stops resisting and the heart opens gently, a transformation occurs. The intensity of the pain remains, perhaps even fully, but it no longer dominates consciousness. It no longer triggers panic. It no longer becomes the lens through which all of life is seen. And instead it becomes a signal, a teacher, companion on the journey. And we begin to recognize that the capacity to experience suffering fully without being consumed by is one of the most profound gifts of emotional intelligence, a skill that allows us to live not in fear of life's inevitable difficulties, but in presence with them. And the mind that is trained in this way begins to notice patterns, habitual reactions, and the habitual tendency to catastrophize, to blame, or to ruminate. And with patient observation, we learn that the more we resist, the more we suffer, and conversely, the more we allow, the more we find relief, because resistance multiplies the experience of suffering while acceptance contains it. And this does not mean that we condone harm or that we stop striving to change circumstances that can be changed, but rather that we separate the feeling from judgment, the experience from a story, the moment from the endless narrative that keeps us trapped in mental struggle. And in doing so, we begin to notice subtle openings in the mind, a quiet space between stimulus and response, a pause in which choice becomes possible, where we can respond to difficulties with wisdom rather than react with automatic fear or anger. And through this ongoing practice, emotional intelligence becomes embodied, living not as a theory, but as a way of being, shaping the rhythm of thought, the tone of feeling, the pace of life, so that even when external circumstances are challenging, the inner self maintains a sense of orientation, clarity, and composure, because we have learned to witness without merging, to feel without collapsing, and to breathe through the waves of emotion as if they were currents in a vast and moving sea in which we are present and alive, yet not overwhelmed. And this awareness is not something that arrives instantly, but gradually through thousands of small moments of attention, of naming, of breathing, of noticing, and of allowing. We begin to experience a deepening of understanding, a subtle shift in consciousness in which suffering is no longer a tyrant, but a teacher, no longer a trap, but an invitation. And in this new relationship with suffering, even the moments of pain carry a gentle clarity, a presence that reveals not only what is difficult, but also what is precious, what is valuable, and what is worthy of care. And as we continue to practice this way of attending to life, the ordinary challenges, losses, frustrations, and uncertainties of human existence no longer have the power to hijack our inner world, because emotional intelligence has trained the mind to recognize the difference between the raw emotion and the added story, between the fleeting sensation and the identity we mistakenly attach to it. And in doing so, we cultivate not indifference, not numbness, not escape, but presence, clarity, and compassionate engagement with life exactly as it is. And over time, this repeated practice of meeting suffering with awareness, patience, and kindness forms the foundation of a resilient, steady, and enduring inner peace, a peace that does not depend on external circumstances, a peace that remains when storms rage, when loss occurs, when uncertainty looms, and when fear arises, because it is anchored in the deep understanding that to be human is to experience difficulty, and that difficulty, when met consciously, can become a profound teacher, a mirror reflecting the depth of our inner world, the strength of our capacity for compassion. We must notice the inner voice, become aware of its tone, rhythm, and content, to recognize when it is judgmental, comparing, blaming, or catastrophic. And then we must step back, creating a subtle but profound distance between the observer and the critic, understanding that the critic is a conditioned voice shaped by experience, culture, and fear, not an absolute truth. And once we see this clearly, we can begin to choose how to respond, whether to follow it blindly, to argue with it endlessly, or to respond with empathy, curiosity, and patience, allowing ourselves to experience mistakes and shortcomings as part of the human journey rather than proof of failure. And in this way, self-compassion becomes an active practice, a continuous conversation in which we ask ourselves, what do I need right now? What is hurting me? How can I respond with care rather than condemnation? And in answering these questions, the inner world gradually transforms from a battlefield into a sanctuary, Because instead of reacting with fear, shame, or judgment, we respond with understanding, patience, and tender guidance, guiding ourselves gently through the storms of emotion and thought that naturally arise throughout life. And as we deepen this practice, we begin to notice that self-compassion does not mean indulgence or avoidance of responsibility, nor does it excuse harmful behavior, but it creates a foundation of emotional safety from which wiser, calmer, and more balanced actions naturally emerge. Because when the mind is harsh, reactive, and judgmental, behavior often mirrors this inner turbulence. Whereas when the mind is steady, compassionate, and aware, choices arise from clarity rather than fear. And relationships with others improve as a natural consequence, because the inner climate shapes the outer world. And Christophe André emphasizes that the capacity to treat oneself kindly is inseparable from the ability to navigate life skillfully, because without self-compassion,
One of the deepest sources of human suffering lies not in the challenges we face in the outside world, but in the way we treat ourselves within. In the quiet commentary, the harsh judgments, the relentless expectations, and the inner voice that rarely shows kindness. And yet most people are unaware of just how severe and persistent this inner dialogue can be, how it colors every experience, amplifies fear, exaggerates failure, and quietly erodes confidence and serenity over years. Because from a young age we are conditioned to strive, to measure, to compare, and to correct. And when we do not meet these arbitrary standards, we internalize failure as a reflection of our worth, forgetting that being human is inherently imperfect, fragile, and prone to error. And Christophe André reminds us that emotional intelligence is not only the ability to notice and understand emotions, but also the capacity to treat ourselves with the same gentleness and care that we instinctively offer to those we love. And that the cultivation of self-compassion is central to this process. Because when we respond to our own mistakes, fears, and discomfort with understanding rather than harshness, we create a safe space within, a refuge where we can feel without fear, reflect without panic, and learn without shame. And yet practicing self-compassion requires courage, because it runs counter to a lifetime of conditioning, a culture that prizes strength over vulnerability, achievement over presence, and perfection over humanity. And so the inner critic has been relentless, whispering that to slow down, to rest, to acknowledge emotion, or to forgive oneself is weakness, when in reality, the opposite is true. Acknowledging our pain, embracing our mistakes, and treating ourselves with kindness is one of the most courageous and transformative acts we can undertake. And emotional intelligence gives us the skill and awareness to do just that. Because first,
emotional intelligence cannot fully mature, and inner peace remains fragile, dependent on circumstances or external validation. Whereas with self-compassion, the mind becomes a safe and reliable companion, one that can experience joy, sorrow, fear, and hope without being overwhelmed, one that can reflect, observe, and respond with equanimity. And in this way, self-compassion allows the development of resilience, because mistakes and setbacks no longer shatter confidence, but become opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow. And this shift in perspective is not theoretical. It is experiential, arising from repeated practice, from noticing judgment, pausing, breathing, and responding with kindness. And over time, it rewires habitual patterns of thought and emotion, so that fear diminishes, shame softens, and a deep inner steadiness emerges, a steadiness in which presence, clarity, and courage coexist, allowing us to live fully without collapsing under the weight of our own internal expectations or criticisms. And as this inner work continues, we also cultivate humility, recognizing our limitations, accepting our fragility, and embracing impermanence, understanding that to be human is to experience uncertainty, loss, error, and vulnerability, and that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to meet life as it is, with courage, awareness, and tenderness toward oneself. And this realization transforms not only the inner world, but also our engagement with others, because a mind and heart trained in compassion and observation responds differently to conflict, challenge, and connection, choosing understanding over reaction, patience over judgment, presence over distraction, and yet none of this is automatic. It arises slowly, through repeated acts of noticing, breathing, reflecting, and befriending oneself in moments both mundane and intense. In the small moments of self-kindness, when a mind whispers criticism, but we answer with gentleness. Our behavior, in this pause, though subtle, transforms relationships, because when we respond rather than react, we model emotional regulation, empathy, and respect, which invites the same qualities from others, gradually creating a relational climate of trust and understanding, rather than fear and defensiveness. And yet, cultivating this awareness requires courage, because it forces us to confront the rawness of our own emotional life, to notice patterns of attachment, rejection, and projection, to see where old hurts influence current interactions, and to acknowledge the fragility of both ourselves and those we care about. And through this continuous observation, emotional intelligence deepens, revealing that true connection is not achieved through control, manipulation, or compliance, but through presence, honesty, and empathy. And that empathy is not only the ability to understand another's perspective, but also the capacity to feel compassion without losing oneself, to offer attention and care without becoming overwhelmed, to engage without dependency, and to witness without judgment. And as we practice these skills, we begin to notice that conflicts, misunderstandings, and emotional turbulence are not obstacles to connection, but invitations to greater awareness, teaching us about boundaries, needs, fears, and the ways in which we can both honor ourselves and honor others. And Christophe André emphasizes that forgiveness, patience, and clarity are central to relational intelligence, because holding on to resentment, judgment, or reactive anger damages the inner world as much as it affects relationships. And learning to release, to communicate calmly, and to establish boundaries without aggression allows the mind to remain centered even in challenging interactions. And this inner steadiness becomes the foundation for emotional resilience in relationships, allowing us to navigate difficult conversations, misunderstandings, and conflicts with presence and dignity. And through this conscious inhabitation of the present, we begin to notice patterns in our mind and heart, the automatic reactions, habitual judgments, and emotional triggers that usually go unnoticed. And by observing them without clinging or resistance, we cultivate a profound understanding of ourselves, learning not only what we feel, but why, how we habitually respond, and what deeper needs or fears are being expressed. And presence is not about eliminating thought or emotion, nor about seeking comfort or escape, but about meeting each moment exactly as it is, whether it is filled with joy, sorrow, tension, or uncertainty. And this meeting is an act of courage because it requires openness, honesty, and vulnerability, the willingness to allow life in all its complexity to unfold within consciousness without trying to fix, control, or avoid it. And in this acceptance, the mind gradually loosens its grip on fear and resistance, allowing a deep calm to emerge even amid challenge. And yet presence also requires the body as an anchor, because emotions and sensations are always first felt in the body, and when awareness rests in the chest, belly, or breath, the mind is steadied, the heart is centered, and the flood of thought can be observed without being swept away. And Christophe André emphasizes that when we combine awareness of body, mind, and emotion, we create a stable platform for living fully, noticing not only what is pleasant, but also what is uncomfortable, and learning to remain grounded in discomfort as well as ease, because true presence includes all aspects of life, the transient, the permanent, the pleasurable, the painful, the ordinary, and the extraordinary, and this inclusive attention transforms experience from a series of reactive episodes into a continuous, living awareness, a dialogue with a world that is both receptive and deliberate, noticing sensations, thoughts, and emotions without identifying with them, allowing them to rise. peak and subside naturally, like waves in a vast ocean in which we are fully immersed yet not overwhelmed. And as presence deepens, the ordinary tasks of life, washing dishes, walking, listening, speaking, working, become rich opportunities for practice, for awareness, for integration, for living fully. And the mind that once hurried, ruminated, or sought escape now finds a steady rhythm, an attentive, observant flow in which each moment is both an opportunity for engagement and a lesson in letting go. Because when attention is present, distraction diminishes, judgment softens, and clarity arises. And in this clarity, choice becomes possible, allowing us to respond rather than react, to act with wisdom rather than habit, to interact with others from understanding rather than projection, and to live in a manner that is both authentic and grounded. And yet, cultivating presence is not a one-time achievement, but a lifelong practice, a continual returning to the moment, a repeated noticing, a gentle correction when the mind wanders, an ongoing dialogue with body, heart, and consciousness. And in this continual practice, subtle shifts accumulate, and over time, life itself transforms, ordinary experience becomes richer, and the mind becomes capable of sustaining calm, awareness, and joy in ways that were previously unimaginable, because presence does not remove difficulty, discomfort, or uncertainty, but it allows these experiences to be met with steadiness, understanding, and emotional clarity. And as this skill deepens, it enhances every aspect of life, from relationships to work, from creativity to decision-making. Because a mind trained in presence can notice subtleties, anticipate reactions, respond wisely, and sustain inner calm in ways that reactive, distracted, or habitual consciousness cannot. And through these repeated acts of returning to awareness, life gradually shifts from being a series of events experienced passively or reactively to a rich, conscious, engaged journey in which we inhabit our own body, mind, and heart fully, noticing, breathing, feeling, reflecting, and participating with openness and curiosity. And in this way, presence becomes not merely a skill or a practice, but a fundamental mode of being, a lens through which life is perceived and experienced with clarity, depth, and intimacy, revealing both the fleeting beauty of each moment and the enduring wisdom that emerges from consistent awareness. And ultimately, the cultivation of presence allows us to engage fully with life as it is, to embrace its impermanence, uncertainty, and beauty, to navigate emotions without being overwhelmed, and to discover a quiet steadiness, a grounded clarity, and a luminous inner calm that becomes the foundation for a rich, conscious, and meaningful human life. And this is the essence of Part 5, the art of living fully in the present moment. Practicing awareness continuously, noticing mind, heart, and body, allowing life as it is to unfold, and cultivating the clarity, calm, and resilience that arise when presence becomes a habitual, embodied way of being, where attention sharpens, where presence deepens, and where energy flows effortlessly. And these signals from the body and mind guide us to the places, choices, and relationships that are congruent with our essence. And this integration of body, mind, heart, and values forms the foundation of a meaningful life, because peace that is disconnected from purpose or direction is shallow and easily disturbed, whereas peace rooted in understanding, awareness, and alignment is resilient, enduring, and generative. And part of this practice involves cultivating gratitude, which shifts attention from what is lacking to what is present, noticing the ordinary and extraordinary gifts in daily life, from the simple rhythm of breath to the complex beauty of human connection. And gratitude itself is a powerful anchor, because it reinforces awareness of abundance rather than scarcity, of sufficiency rather than deficiency, of value rather than emptiness. And as gratitude grows, so too does patience, compassion, and openness, because the mind becomes increasingly attuned to noticing rather than judging, appreciating rather than demanding, and receiving rather than resisting. And alongside gratitude, awareness of impermanence provides another anchor for inner peace. Because life is fleeting, circumstances change, relationships evolve, and even our own thoughts and emotions are temporary. And recognizing this impermanence allows us to release clinging, to soften attachment, to meet change with flexibility, and to hold loss, disappointment, and transition with gentleness rather than panic. And in this way, impermanence is not a source of despair, but a guide to presence, appreciation, and acceptance, deepening our ability to live fully in each moment while remaining anchored in what matters most and beyond impermanence. Emotional intelligence, cultivated over years, allows us to respond to life with clarity and discernment, to notice the difference between what we can influence and what we cannot, to distinguish between skillful action and reactive habit, to engage deeply without losing ourselves in anxiety or control, and to navigate relationships, work, and personal challenges with resilience and wisdom. And in this ongoing engagement, a sense of contribution emerges because we realize that life is not only about our own comfort, survival, or achievement, but also about participation, care, and offering to the world around us. And contribution, whether large or small, reinforces meaning and value, strengthens connection, and fosters peace. Because when we recognize our ability to affect others positively, we create a sense of agency and purpose that buffers the mind against despair, helplessness, and chronic dissatisfaction. And yet all of these practices, awareness, alignment with values, gratitude, acceptance of impermanence, conscious action, contribution, require repetition, patience, and gentle persistence, because life continues to present challenges. Emotions arise unbidden, thoughts wander, desires flare, relationships create friction, and the mind easily drifts into old habits of fear, judgment, and distraction. And here the practice of emotional intelligence comes full circle, because each moment of awareness, each pause to breathe, each choice to respond with clarity rather than react with habitual patterns, each act of gratitude or compassion, reinforces the internal architecture of peace, creating a resilient foundation upon which the human spirit can rest even in turbulence. And this foundation is further strengthened by reflection, journaling, meditation, or contemplative awareness, which allow insight into recurring patterns, deeper understanding of values, and the ability to integrate lessons from past experiences into present action. And over time, these repeated acts coalesce into a lived wisdom, a calm presence, a steady orientation, and an abiding inner security that is not dependent on external conditions.